Welcome to the Disability Advantage, learning to do business better from lived experience. This is the show where we get real about leadership, disability, and how to turn good intentions into actual impact. I'm Lesa Bradshaw, international speaker, diversity and disability consultant, and empowerment champion. I help organizations build disability confidence, which leads to big wins for your people and for your business. In this podcast, expect straight talk, humor, practical ideas, and insights. This is Season 2, From Intention to Impact, and we're diving into stories, questions, interviews, and concepts that help you move from thinking to doing. I hope you enjoy the episode, and if it sparks something for you, please share it with your network.
Hi, Lesa. In today's episode, we're tackling the difficult questions hiring managers and leaders often have, but rarely say out loud. You've heard these queries whispered in private conversations for years, and you've always been clear that keeping them in the shadows doesn't help anyone. So today, we're bringing them out into the open, honestly, practically, and with the aim of helping everyone get this right. And before we get into the toughest scenarios leaders face, we need to get the foundations right. Language sets the tone for everything that follows. So let's begin with language. Different regions use terms like persons with determination, handicapped, or disabled person. What terminology is appropriate and why does it matter?
Thanks so much. I think that's a great question because I think it's very often where people first get stuck when they're having the conversation of disability inclusion and they're on the journey to becoming disability confident. I think the important thing to realize is that there is no one singular agreed upon term that everybody in the world agrees on. Okay, I think that it comes down to your community that you're in, the culture that you're in, the individual that you are. And so different people have different preferences. And I'll maybe just share some of my reactions to some of the phraseology so that you can kind of understand the different perspectives. The first thing is when we talk about people of determination, I think that's hysterical because I go, well, really? Have you met all people with disabilities and are they all determined? How can you possibly assign a personality characteristic to a whole demographic of people who only really have one thing in common? And that's that in some way they have an impairment that puts them at a disabling disadvantage. And so for me, we've got to be really careful to use euphemisms that make the word disability seem like a dirty word. The second thing, and the most commonly agreed upon, is, which is what I prefer, is person-first terminology. So I prefer being called a person with a disability. I'm also a person with red hair, person who owns a business. And so the reality is that's one part of my autobiography that makes up who I am. Other people prefer to be called a disabled person because they are disabled by the barriers of everyday life and the realities of an inaccessible world. So I think if you were going to go by a general rule of thumb, I find in Europe and the UK, disabled person tends to be the most frequently agreed upon term. Start with that. And if somebody wants to go with something else, follow that lead. Follow individual preferences and be okay with that. I think in a lot of other areas, person with a disability is a good way to start. It's also more comfortable when you're talking about the different types of disability. So you can say a person with epilepsy, person with a hearing impairment, person with a mobility impairment, person who's a wheelchair user. And that person first terminology just reflects that it's that one part of you that makes you you. So I think my main takeaway is ask what people would prefer when you are the one-on-one and you're discussing the topic of disability. Take the people's lead if they say that they'd prefer something different. And if you're talking generally, using the term person or people with a disability, persons with a disability or disabled persons are generally agreed upon as a suitable phraseology. So I hope that helps.
Fantastic. So many leaders still fear that hiring a disabled candidate may impact performance. You've heard this before. How do you respond?
Oh, that is such a common thing, the dreaded performance stigma. And it generally comes from this full focus on the disability rather than the ability. I think it's such an unconscious bias of ours that we're so concerned about what a person with a disability can't do that we stop looking at what the person with a disability can do. And so that knee-jerk reaction when a line manager or, an employer is saying, well, do we want somebody with a disability? Is, well, first let's understand, what do people with their disability, what are they able to do? And I think that that's your first mistake, because you can have two people with exactly the same disability and impairment, but what disables them is completely different, depending on their circumstance, the individual situation, the support networks around them, the enabling devices. So there's so many different factors that can disable an individual beyond an impairment. So I think for me, instead of making assumptions about what people can and cannot do, instead of focusing on what they can't do rather than what they can do, the better way to move forward is to assume that somebody who's applying for a position or someone that's working with you on something is able to do things. You can ask the question, if you need any assistance or if I need to know anything, let me know, because I'm here to learn with you. And that's absolutely fine, and then learn as you go. But if you're concerned about performance issues, you can say things like, this job is highly customer focused. And so you're going to be dealing with angry customers who are very frustrated. And I've noticed that you've got a stutter. How do you manage that when you are having that conflict situation? Because you're not actually assuming that they cannot communicate. You're seeing how they get over that barrier to deliver and perform in the task that they're required to do it in. And they might give you, well, I do this and I do that, and they give you answers. And then you go, okay, so feasibly, that actually would work quite well. So now all of a sudden, those assumptions fall to the side. And I think that's really important. So when we are thinking about whether somebody is suitable for an opportunity or what somebody with a disability will or won't be able to do, start off by realizing that you don't actually know, and then explore. And then once you've got the facts together, make a decision as to whether that's going to work or not in that situation, or how you can support so that that person can perform. And that makes it so much easier. It means you don't have to be the expert in everybody's disability. Okay, and that for me is where that performance stigma or fear starts to relax, because now you can get the information that you need to get the job done.
So reasonable accommodation is used often, but understood poorly. What does it actually mean in practice?
So reasonable accommodation, it's a bit of an archaic term, but it's very commonly used. We're moving more towards talking about workplace adjustments, because reasonable accommodation, well, who decides what's reasonable, and what gives them the power and privilege to do that? So the reality is, an accommodation means that, all right, then we'll accommodate for your needs. Whereas in reality, we reasonably accommodate for everybody all of the time. If you've got somebody who has got 3 children and needs to drop them off at school before they get to work, and you go, well, we'll give you a bit of flexi time, come in half an hour later and work half an hour later. Well, we've made workplace adjustments or reasonable accommodation for someone who has that need. So when we talk about reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities, it's simply this. What is the barrier that is disabling you, that might be preventing you from doing this in this way, in this environment? What can we do to remove that barrier so that now that you are enabled to perform and to do what you need to do in that environment? I don't know. Let's have a conversation. I know the environment and the role. You know the environment, the role, and you know the disabling barrier, and you know the impact of the adjustment. So reasonable accommodation or workplace adjustments is really just a term to say, we understand that we have not built our economy and our world in an accessible and inclusive way for everybody. So in reality, we have to do something proactive to remove disabling barriers. And reasonable accommodation or workplace adjustments is exactly that.
So how should employers handle situations where a requested adjustment genuinely can't be provided?
Yeah, I think, realistically speaking, because we haven't designed with accessibility in mind from the beginning, we often have to go and retrofit the way we do something, or a building, or an environmental factor. And so in a realistic world, sometimes it can't be done. I think firstly, you have to explore ways around it. So you've got to be quite creative. I remember before the COVID pandemic, a lot of employers were very reluctant to allow people to work from home, because they were like, well, no, they've got to come into the office because that's part of the team, and we can then monitor that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and we don't trust them to work from home. And so when we asked for an adjustment, that said, can this individual work from home? Because that would really enable them to do the job without all the barriers that are out there. The answer was often, well, no, because that's against our company policy. And yet what we proved, and they gave justification, we'd have to give them data, we'd have to give them laptops, we'd have to trust and change our performance systems and the way we communicate. Oh, it wouldn't work. And then within 2 months, we changed the world. And we did it for everybody on a mass scale. So it proved to you that it's not that it was not reasonable to do. It was that the motivation and return on investment wasn't perceived to be worthwhile. And so sometimes there's going to be a disruptive rethink of how something should be done. And that's what exploring a reasonable adjustment or workplace adjustment involves. If you truly have done that, and it will not allow, remove that barrier to the point where that person is able to perform in the role at the standard which you require, then you can say, right, we've explored everything. I don't know what else to do from here, but right now, realistically, it's not going to work. What I have learned, though, is so much about how we need to plan for the future. And so then it's incumbent on you to go and take what you've learned and ensure that you don't keep recreating those barriers. So if, for example, it's you're on the 5th floor of a building and you can't put an elevator in, and there's no ways you can do hybrid work or bring someone down to a low ground, and that's just, you can't do it, you don't own the building. Next time you rent a building, make sure you rent an accessible building. Hold your landlords accountable for making that building accessible. Do something proactive to stop recreating those barriers in the way that you move forward in business. And slowly what happens is organically our world and our economy becomes more accessible for all.
So
Absolutely.
in an interview, if a candidate discloses a non-visible disability, what can a line manager ask and what should they avoid?
That's a great question. And I think, again, look at the purpose of the discussion. So the purpose of an interview is to determine somebody's ability levels and suitability to an environment or a role. So asking a question about their disability, like, oh, shame, that must be terrible for you. How did that happen? Or when did this first start? None of that is relevant. Asking personal questions about a person's lived experience of a non-visible disability, that's not necessary or relevant. However, if the purpose is to ask about how they perform in the role, well, that's precisely why you're in an interview. So let's say that a person says that I have epilepsy, okay, and your concerns are safety risk, okay? It's completely okay then to go, all right, so working in that particular environment, we obviously have safety policies and we're concerned that you might be around manufacturing equipment. And so if you have a seizure, how does it impact, or what do I need to understand about the implication or the safety risk, and how can we mitigate that risk? What steps can we put in place that will ensure that that risk is not real and relevant? So you're asking a genuine question about somebody's disability or the functional impact of that disability in an environment where it might be disabling or harmful, and you're wanting to understand how it impacts so that you can explore ways around it. Now, you might have somebody with epilepsy that goes, well, my particular type of epilepsy, when I do have a seizure, it tends to be in a very hot or very crowded or very, busy environment, which this environment is not. It's in an office environment or whatever. So I'm not concerned that the trigger is going to be there. But also, if I do have a seizure, I tend to feel it coming on. So I get a slightly dissociative feeling. And that gives me ample time to be able to get to a place of safety. So the only support I would require is maybe for my team to know that if I start to behave a little bit strangely, or if I say, listen, I'm not good, I need to get to a safe place, that somebody knows how to just get me there. And if I do have a seizure, on the off chance that perhaps the team, we've got a safety officer or somebody that we can call who's trained on putting me in the recovery position, and we can kind of move past it. So we mitigate the risk that way. And whereas somebody else might go, well, I actually can't work in that environment. So, I don't think this is going to be suitable for me, because nobody wants to put them themselves in a place of harm. So I think that as long as you keep it specific to the function, the job, the environment, and genuinely say the environment of the job is this, you've disclosed this, how does that impact? What do I need to know? What can I do that would support or enable or make it easier for you And honestly, that's a question you would really ask anybody, I suppose. How can we support you best so that you can perform and thrive?
So I think what you're saying is, as long as it's a data-driven request or an information request where you're really trying to assess the situation, it brings me nicely into if the disability is visible. That's not something you necessarily have to disclose. Is it acceptable for them to ask what happened, show sympathy, or call somebody brave? What's respectful?
I always struggle with this because I'm a wheelchair user, so you can see straight away that I have a disability. It's hard to hide. And it is funny how people tend to think that when I do something quite standard, like shopping, or going on holiday, that some people go, gosh, you're such an inspiration to me. And honestly, on a personal level, if I inspire somebody, well, that's a privilege. But it always makes me think, but why? I'm shopping. This is not an inspirational act. So on the other side, it also reflects this assumption that we've got such low standards of expectation of what we think a person with a disability can do, that when we do something quite standard, it's seen as brave and inspiring. So I'm often quite conflicted, and I think it's a very personal preference as to whether somebody is going to feel comfortable telling you about their disability or being called brave and inspiring, or what they consider respectful and not. I think for me, as a starting point, until you get to know that person and you know their preferences, just speak to the person as you would like to be spoken to. So if you're in an environment where you wouldn't want some complete stranger to ask you personal questions about yourself, then don't ask that person personal questions. If you are at a party and you're sharing information about each other and it's personal by nature, well, then it might be okay to broach that subject. So I think for me, it's really about look to context to decide what can and cannot be asked. In the work setting, you treat that person with respect and with dignity as you would anybody else. You assume competence. If you come across a barrier, always, like I had a conversation with someone the other day and I didn't realize until I met them because I'd been chatting via text. When I met them, they have cerebral palsy and the communication is quite impacted. And I honestly, between me having a South African accent, them having a British accent and having a communication slur, it sort of came out as a slur, I couldn't understand a word of what this person was saying. And I was genuinely honest. I didn't say, awkwardness or, oh, this is, you're so inspiring to be this. I didn't expect that you were going to be disabled or some of those knee-jerk reactions. I simply went, it's lovely to meet you. And then after one or two sentences, I said, we're going to have to figure out a different way to communicate because until my ear is trained to hear you, which I'm quite sure it will be after, a little time, can we maybe also just supplement by text, or are there any suggestions that you have that we can get this communication going? And the person laughed and they were like, they've done this. This is not their first rodeo. And he was able to guide me through. So I think just for me, treating people with respect and dignity, obviously everybody wants to be treated that way. Look to the context to decide what type of level of share you're going to be asking for or approaching, and say, is that acceptable in that context? Respect the individuals are all going to be different. So if somebody doesn't like what you've said, be okay with going, I'm so sorry, I think I may have offended you. And I'm on this journey of learning too. So can we move forward with, forgive me and let's move on. Don't dwell on it. It's impossible for you to anticipate the needs of every human being on this planet. So be okay to take someone's lead and learn as you go. And I think at the end of the day, one thing that really bugs me, always assume that person knows what's best for them. Please don't make decisions on behalf of people with disabilities because we are not incompetent children. We have the capacity to self-preserve and we want to survive and we want to live our best lives. So don't assume that you need to make that call without actually asking our preferences as well. And hopefully that's a bit of a couple of rule of thumbs when it comes to that etiquette and, what you can and cannot say.
And I think what's so interesting about the last couple of answers that comes through quite strongly is just ask if you're unsure.
Sure.
Just hold space and ask.
Yeah.
So some managers worry that adjusting the workplace for one or two people just takes too much time. How do you explain the real return on that investment?
Oh, that's such a great question. It's so, you've got to have a look at the realities of the world we live in. Their stats are estimating that 15% of the world's population have a disability, that it is a huge and significant consumer market, that the way our economy is evolving into the digital space is requiring a lot more flexibility in the ways that we service our customers and our communities, because people are wanting individual preferences in the way that they receive service and so on, and products. And so for me, if there's one thing I can tell you, if you know anybody with a disability, you'll figure out that they've had to learn how to do life in slightly different ways. So creativity and problem solving and exploring ways to get something done in a different way it's a life skill that you have to actually develop in this world that we live in, and apply that to the workspace, and suddenly you get a different frame of reference. And for me, you've got to look at the abilities of people who live in a world that don't include them. And for those people that are now being brought to your doorstep and you have the privilege of having them in your team or in your community, what you can learn from people with disabilities to design and deliver better for everybody is really quite astounding. The other thing I would also suggest is that I know that there's a disruption that happens. I often speak, for example, to IT leaders. And I say to IT leadership, we want to include people with disabilities in your IT department. And they go, yeah, that's an HR thing. They're better in admin or HR, not really in IT. But when we show you how the digital economy is demanding accessibility for all, I go, a key requirement of being an IT leader in today's economy is that you need to know about accessible design. We've got the European Accessibility Act that's just come out that makes this is by law. This must be done. And so if the best way to truly keep yourself honest in what you do is to have somebody with lived experience traveling the journey with you. So you might be designing for accessibility of 2 people out of 50 in your team. But what you're learning from those 2 people is, when I continue to do and deliver this digital service that I'm doing, is it still accessible? Is it still workable? What should I be thinking when I designed it from scratch? What would actually help you as a customer? I'm not just going to ask you to. Let's go and ask other people. And let's go and find out from lived experience what I need to be doing to be proactive around separating the level and experience of my service from my competitor. And that for me is huge. So I think when it comes to the return on investment, it's not about accommodating for a person with a disability. It's around learning how to do things differently so that it benefits everybody. And we can throw lots of purple pound stats out there to show how this is good from an economic perspective, how disability confident companies are actually so much more competitive in their shareholder returns, because what they've done is they've learned that flexibility, adaptability, and servicing the needs of individuals to deliver a better service for everybody is going to give them a magnificent competitive advantage. So aside from the human impact, aside from, just it's good for everyone when people thrive, there's also that competitive value.
So Lesa, just as a final thought to managers who might still have some burning questions, what advice would you give them?
I would probably say you don't have to start this journey from scratch. So put your feelers out, learn from each other, contact allies and people that have done this journey. Share with other organizations and businesses what you've learned and what you need to know, because we've already solved most of the problems that you think might be coming up if you do take this journey towards disability confidence. So the first thing is, you're not alone. It's not all on you. You are not expected to have all the answers or for it to be perfect. You are expected to be curious, and as you learn, to respond differently to the way that you do things. And so if I say anything to leadership, it's really about this. In today's world, this is not just an HR thing. This is not just a compliance thing. This is actually a competitive return on investment thing. And if you're not getting in the mix of how to become disability confident as an organization, it is going to impact you negatively in your brand and in the way that you actually deliver the services. So see this as a really good journey of learning. You're not there yet, but if you invite the lived experience insights of those people in your organization and in your supply chain, you can learn exponentially how to do business better. And so be okay with that. Don't be so scared of getting it wrong that you don't want to start the journey of getting it right. Don't be so scared to ask for the information that you need in order to make good decisions and solve problems moving forward. And be honest about we know that this is an evolution. And so I can't get it everywhere right now. But if every single leader did something in their area of influence that would remove disabling barriers, you would have this little drop in the ocean that then becomes a little ripple. And those ripples of change, people start thinking. It starts going from back of mind to front of mind. People start noticing. Conversations around the coffee machine start happening. And before you know it, we've got this tidal wave of change that really impacts with greatness.
Lesa, thank you so much for sharing some of these difficult questions, answering them in such a thoughtful, impactful manner. I really hope that this conversation is going to help people move from that fear state into disability confidence. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Anel.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Disability Advantage. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on the future ones. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to share it. Until next time, keep turning intention into real, lasting impact. I'm always looking to hear stories from others as well. So if you would like any support on your disability confidence journey, please give me a shout. Contact me via lesa@bradshawlarue.co.za or via my website www.lesabradshawinternational.com.